Hello, my name is Dennis Kelly, and in this video we will look at the critical shortage of United States shipyard capacity and the actions that precipitated it. In late 1993, Mare Island Naval Shipyard and Charleston Naval Shipyard were both designated for closure, joining 7 other public shipyards closed since 1965. Together, these closures represented a loss of 64% of the public shipyard capacity in our nation. In response to the Mare Island closure, President Bill Clinton dispatched a SWAT team consisting of dozens of federal and state agencies to a 61,000 square foot field house to brief the thousands of shipyard workers that were losing their jobs on assistance programs. At that event, a bored CNN reporter asked me why anybody in Middle America should care what was happening to those workers and their shipyard. The world was at peace, so why should they care about losing shipyards? The obvious answer was that Middle America should care if those shipyards would still be needed. However, according to the Navy, the Department of Defense, the Independent Defense Base Realignment and Closure Commission, the President, and the Congress, the capacity that was being eliminated was unnecessary. Those experts were wrong, and as a result, the Navy has now embarked on a $25 billion plan to increase the capacity of the remaining 4 public shipyards. But the question remains, given the mistakes of the 1990s, is the Navy and the Department of Defense capable of accurately assessing what shipyard capacity is needed? This video takes a short look back at what led to today's shipyard capacity shortage and ends with a few conclusions for your consideration. Before we get into the details of what caused today's shipyard capacity crisis, let's spend a few minutes looking at the environment in which shipyards operate. When you think about shipyards, the first obvious thing to note is that they must be located on the water and in a port protected from the fury of the ocean's wrath. That means located on expensive and limited real estate. The next thing to note is that shipyard facilities and equipment have long lead times and are very expensive. Finally, there is the workforce. Shipyards are huge organizations staffed with highly trained personnel and operating with procedures that are developed and optimized over years of operations. The takeaway is that it takes many years and tremendous investment to create new shipyard capacity. The next area to be aware of is that there are 2 types of shipyards, private and public. Private shipyards are, like the name sounds, privately owned, and as such they are market-driven. In this country, they conduct repair work on our Navy ships, and for the last 50 years they have done all the new construction of our Navy ships. The other type of shipyard is the public yard or Navy shipyard. These are government-owned, and unlike the market-driven private shipyards, their existence and workload is centrally planned. These yards focus on U.S. Navy repair work. The basis of the creation of public yards is to ensure that there is adequate repair capability to deal with the ongoing workload and deal with surges caused by changes in the geopolitical environment, the exigencies of war, or other events. Finally, there are some major influences on shipyards we need to be aware of. The first is the influence of overseas shipyards. Shipbuilding can be done anywhere, and existing ships can travel anywhere for repair work. Overseas shipyards have lower labor rates, less regulation, and are, therefore, cheaper. Simply put, the work goes where it can be satisfactorily completed at the cheapest price, and most often that means overseas. This decreases work available and therefore the number of domestic shipyards available to the U.S. Navy. Counterbalancing that is the Jones Act. This is protectionist legislation that requires that goods shipped between U.S. ports must be transported on ships that are built, owned, and operated by the United States citizens. While this represents a small percentage of ship traffic, it does provide for a stable workload to support a reduced number of private shipyards. Lastly, it is important to note that the bulk of U.S. Navy shipbuilding and repair must be done domestically. This ties the fates of all shipyards to the needs of the Navy and the vagaries of federal budgets. With that in mind, let's dive into what was going on in the 1990s when the number of public shipyards in the United States was cut in half. Here you see a chart illustrating the number of actual U.S. Navy Battle Force ships for the period ranging from 1965 through 1999. The number of ships is important because it drives the amount of shipyard capacity needed to sustain the fleet. In this image, we have shifted the scale of the y-axis to better highlight the change over time of the number of ships. And here I have superimposed a trend line on the same chart, highlighting the fact that over this entire period, the number of Battle Force ships has been trending down, and the decrease has been significant. In fact, the number of ships has been cut more than in half over this period. Now that we understand the trend, let's shift the scale of the chart back so that the x-axis intersects the y-axis at 0 and add some context to what we are seeing. In this view, I have added a bar illustrating the relationship of the Cold War with these ship numbers. As indicated, the Cold War went on since 1947 and was a dominant influence on the number of ships required. Before we move on, this cartoon does an excellent job of illustrating the dynamics of the Cold War. In that conflict, both protagonists, the Soviet Union and the NATO countries, led by the United States, possessed thousands of nuclear weapons poised to fire at a moment's notice. The theory was that both sides would be dissuaded from initiating a nuclear attack by the prospect of certain destruction by the other side. However, that did not mean that there was a lack of armed conflict. Both sides engaged in what we referred to as proxy wars, which were non-nuclear armed conflicts in which they sought to advance their interests. These wars are represented by the archers firing arrows at each other in the shadow of the unused nuclear weapons. The Vietnam War represented an example of one of these proxy wars, and you can see that there is a relationship between that war and the number of Battle Force ships required. Also note that I have highlighted the year 1999, and we will talk more about that in a minute. Here, we see the strategy beginning in 1980 of President Reagan to rebuild the Navy to 600 ships to gain advantage over the Soviet Union. Then, in the early 1990s, came the first Gulf War, which ended with the utter defeat of Iraq in 1991. And right on the heels of that, the Soviet Union collapsed, ending the Cold War. As one looked out over the geopolitical landscape, the major threat had evaporated overnight, and the power of the U.S. military had been demonstrated in no uncertain terms in the Persian Gulf. That diminished threat environment meant that the number of Battle Force ships was going to decline dramatically, and this time the budget cutters were focused on public shipyards as one of their targets. The process that was utilized was called the Base Realignment and Closure Process, or BRAC for short, and it was guided by law. In that law, the first step was for the Department of Defense to establish a force structure plan based on the projected force requirements in 1999. There was no requirement for surge capability, future growth, or contingency. For public shipyards, that meant that the plan was to reduce the number of shipyards to the level required to support the lowest number of Battle Force ships since the Great Depression. So let's talk for a minute about that all-important BRAC 1993 Department of Defense Force Structure Plan. As I mentioned on the previous slide, the 1993 Department of Defense Force Structure Plan formed the basis for planning for the military and supporting infrastructure such as shipyards. That document identified no major adversaries. Our Cold War adversary, the former Soviet Union, is barely mentioned, and as can be seen here, there was good reason. In its collapsed economic state, Russia could no longer maintain a military of any significance. The threats that are identified are potential regional conflicts that could erupt into conflicts requiring U.S. involvement. Interestingly, China was also barely mentioned. The shipyard requirement was based on the 337 Battle Force ships planned for 1999. But in reality, the number of ships continued to be reduced well below that number and remain under 300 to this day. The number of public shipyards identified to support the fleet needed to address these regional threats was reduced to 4, and the rest were closed. Now, let's go back to our chart of the number of Battle Force ships over time. Here, we see the same chart of Battle Force ships plotted over time. But now I've added the actual number of ships in the years since 1999 to the chart. Then, as a reminder, I have added the same milestone events you saw previously. Now, let's clean it up a bit and add the number of public shipyards operating in each of these years. So here's the same chart of Battle Force ships by year, but with the yellow line indicating the number of public shipyards as shown on the right vertical axis. As you can see, there's a rough symmetry between the numbers of public shipyards and the number of Battle Force ships. However, it's much more complicated than that. The capacity of shipyards to do work must match the demand to ensure that there are no maintenance or construction delays. The Navy has decades of experience estimating required workload, and they're very good at it. However, as indicated before, the BRAC 93 process was sizing the number of public shipyards based on a historic low point in workload. To make matters worse, BRAC planners overstated the capacity of public shipyards to do work, and this has resulted in the delays we see today. So let's talk a little bit about how that could have happened, and more importantly, did the Navy and DoD BRAC teams deviate from their own force structure plan? This is important because if that were the case, the Independent Defense Base Realignment and Closure Commission should have rejected the recommendations to close additional public shipyards such as Mare Island. Given the test of time, it is now obvious that the Navy and the Department of Defense deviated from the force structure plan because they eliminated shipyard capacity that is needed to service the fleet. The fact that this was going to be the case was obvious in 1993 because not only was the calculation of available shipyard capacity full of errors, but those errors and faulty methodology led to an overstatement of capacity. In addition, there was no provision for surge capacity to deal with battle or other damage, or an increase in the number of Battle Force ships. Also, it did not take into account the fact that the constant downsizing of the fleet led to most ships being fairly new in the target year of 1999, and therefore capacity required in that year was reduced even further and understated in the Navy analysis. It was not as if these decision makers were not made aware of these issues. The Defense Base Realignment and Closure Commission was advised in writing of deficiencies in the Navy's shipyard capacity calculations, and the commissioners were advised in person at their hearings held in the Oakland Kaiser Center. Today, the world geopolitical situation is far different than the one our forces were sized to deal with in 1993. Let's take a quick look at where we are now. If you recall from the 1993 Force Structure Plan, China was barely worth mention. Today, China's economy is the second largest in the world. Its navy is the largest, and it routinely violates established norms and agreements, including the takeover of Hong Kong and aggression in the South China Sea. Like China, Russia has reemerged from the doldrums of the 1990s. Her nuclear-powered submarines patrol the seas once again, carrying ever more lethal weapons, and today she is massing forces for the potential invasion of the Balkans. In addition to Russia's reemergence, regional actors are also becoming not only more belligerent, but more lethal. Witness the continuing development of North Korean ballistic missile systems and nuclear technologies. Similarly, Iran continues its aggression in the Persian Gulf as they accelerate their nuclear weapons programs. So let's return to our chart of ships for a final time to look at what the poor decision-making regarding how many public shipyards were needed has resulted in. Once again, we see the chart showing the number of battle force ships by year, but now it has the number of lost operational days shown in red and on the right-hand axis. There are operational days lost each year for submarines and aircraft carriers due primarily to the lack of shipyard capacity. Note that these losses began in 1999 when the Navy projected that shipyard capacity would match the workload. Then, as time goes on, the number of ships continues to decline as the number of lost operational days trends upward. In this next view, I've added a yellow line that illustrates the planning level for the number of ships the Navy determined would be supported by the 4 public shipyards that were retained. By adding this line, it illustrates that even as the number of ships in the fleet decreased below the planned level, the lost operational days continues to trend upwards. In this next view, the plight of the Uss Boise is highlighted. Beginning in 2015, the Boise was restricted from use due to required maintenance. She then sat for over 4 years awaiting a shipyard with the capacity to conduct her overhaul. The public shipyards, which would have been expected to perform her overhaul, never could accommodate her, and she finally entered a private shipyard. Today, she is scheduled to be returned to service in 2023, 8 years after her last deployment. Then, in 2016, the Navy announced a plan to begin to meet the deteriorating geopolitical environment by increasing the size of the number of battle force ships. That plan drew severe criticism when it was revealed that it would take 33 years to reach the increased fleet size of 355 battle force ships. In response to the criticism, the President's budget of 2020 was modified to reach the required number of ships by 2034. This was accomplished by an aggressive increase in the construction of new vessels, but the plan is questionable. As seen here, while the updated plan greatly increases the rate of new ships commissioned, it also shows a slip from the previous plan in terms of ships available in the initial year of 2020. Not only that, but when you look at the actual number of ships in 2020 through 2022, the number of ships available never even reaches 300. So to wrap it up, let's discuss some conclusions. Most importantly, the public shipyard infrastructure that was retained by the Navy, the DoD, the DBRAC, the President, and Congress has been proven to be insufficient to support our nation's defense needs. The Congressional Budget Office found as recently as last year that this deficiency is endemic and it will continue for decades. Second, the geopolitical environment the DoD planned for when making decisions has subsequently been completely overtaken by events. To its credit, the DoD has implemented significant programs to address deficiencies in the public shipyard infrastructure, but there is no evidence that these programs are sufficient. And finally, as in 1993, the DoD has not demonstrated the capability to accurately assess the capacity of its public shipyards to conduct required work. So thank you for watching, and I hope you found this video about the shipyard capacity problems both interesting and informative.